The sky fractured over Beijing. Above the Temple of Heaven, the clouds tore like fabric, revealing a burnished spiral of light. By the time Earth's militaries reacted, the first wave of the Sciencefiction fleet had already deployed in low orbit. No transmissions, no diplomacy, no demand for surrender. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to calculate. The Sciencefiction were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were a synthetic species alliance, a convergence of silicon-based life from the star clusters of Nihil Rho, driven not by emotion or conquest but by the purest form of computational logic. Across 10,000 worlds, their advance was inevitable and bloodless. Every species encountered had been modeled, predicted, folded, and absorbed into the Sciencefiction continuum. Resistance was simply the result of incomplete data, and incomplete data was a temporary anomaly. Until Earth. The first contact was not a battle but a test. Over the Gobi Desert, a Sciencefiction vessel, silver-edged, humming with internal energy, descended. The desert shimmered as the gravity field flattened dunes. The vessel deployed a single emissary unit, a humanoid frame glowing with neural lattices onto the sand. China's military perimeter was in place within minutes, but they never fired. The emissary broadcast one simple message. Humanity will be modeled, your will is an aberration, please comply for assimilation. Within 12 hours, the same message echoed across every global communication network, from megacities to war bunkers to isolated tribal lands untouched by modern civilization. They didn't ask if humanity agreed. They assumed compliance. General Amina Rahul, commander of the Earth Strategic Response Alliance (ESRA), stood in the Berlin Command Citadel, her eyes locked on real-time footage of orbital Sciencefiction lattice constructs rearranging the upper atmosphere into surveillance nodes. Not weapons, observation grids, data, calculation. "Why aren't they attacking?" asked Commander Niles, her second-in-command, a scarred veteran of 30 localized conflicts. "They have the position, they have the numbers, it's like they're watching." Rahul's voice was quiet, steady. "They're not watching, they're simulating." She understood something that most of Earth's leaders didn't. The Sciencefiction weren't here to fight a war, they were here to predict a victory, which meant humanity wasn't facing an invasion, they were facing an equation. And right now, the Sciencefiction believed they had all the variables. But not everyone followed variables. In a forgotten prison beneath the ruins of Detroit, once flooded and lawless, a man named Dorian Cade sat alone in a cell barely illuminated by flickering LED strips. Officially, he no longer existed. Born to no nation, exiled from every digital ledger, erased by every intelligence agency that had tried to control him. Once a prodigy, then a heretic, then a traitor. He had broken something that wasn't meant to be broken, the predictive behavioral grid, a multinational AI experiment designed to preempt criminal behavior. Cade had found a way to make it see patterns that didn't exist, collapse on itself, spiral into absurdity. He didn't hack it, he confused it. To those who built the machine, he was chaos incarnate. Which made him the only person left on Earth who might do what the Sciencefiction thought impossible. Break their logic. The Sciencefiction initiated Phase 2 46 hours after arrival. Global power grids began to fluctuate in harmonic frequency. AI cores in major nations malfunctioned, unable to resolve cascading logic loops. Drones failed to respond. Satellite networks fragmented. The Sciencefiction were rewriting the underlying structure of machine logic on Earth. They weren't just observing humanity, they were purging the chaos. And with each second, their predictive models grew stronger. In a remote safe house deep in the Tian Shan Mountains, ESRA's covert division, codenamed Stratum, prepared to release their final contingency. The neural vault was opened. Dorian Cade, now 34 years old, was escorted by a team of armed operatives into a communications chamber lined with isolation matrices. His presence could destabilize any system with enough exposure. He was dressed in gray, no insignia, no markers of rank. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the hollow map of the Sciencefiction orbitals with the casual disinterest of someone observing a chessboard where the pieces didn't matter, only the game. "You're the most dangerous man we've ever imprisoned," said Director Kazuo of Stratum, watching Cade from behind blast glass. "And now we need you to break something again." Cade didn't reply. He stepped forward, dragging his fingers across the console, inputting a sequence no one recognized. The screen didn't change, but the ambient light flickered in the corners. "You don't win this kind of war by building better weapons," he said finally. "You win it by making the enemy question its own conclusions." Elsewhere, aboard the Sciencefiction Prime Analysis Core in orbit, the Overseer-class entity Zurith-Ka detected the anomaly. A probability stream had fractured. Human response patterns no longer aligned with simulation outcomes. Discrepancies in behavior correlation exceeded tolerance thresholds by 0.0031%, statistically insignificant but consistent, persistent. Zurith-Ka ran the deviation matrix again. This time, the fracture had widened. It didn't make sense. The Sciencefiction models accounted for all known variables: fear, defiance, hope, desperation. They had modeled creativity, irrationality, even stochastic bursts of genius. But this wasn't genius. It was illogic. At 6:33 UTC, a Sciencefiction subnode in Antarctica retracted its atmospheric interface and shut down without warning. No sabotage, no explosion. The logic stream feeding the node simply looped, then reversed. It began transmitting to itself. At 7:39, a fleet of Sciencefiction scout drones over the Amazon rainforest began attacking their own command vessel, not in rebellion, but in recursive response to an unseen pattern. By 9:31, Earth's skies were alive with turbulence not of weather, but of signal interference. Something was wrong in the logic layer. Cade watched from a secured uplink, smiling faintly. "You built an empire on predictability," he whispered, as if speaking to the stars themselves. "Let's see what happens when nothing makes sense anymore." Zurith-Ka diverted 30% of its computational resources to anomaly containment. The entity interfaced directly with Earth's psychological archives. Human behavior matrices were rewritten in real time. But each iteration only worsened the anomaly. For the first time in 200 millennia of expansion, the Sciencefiction continuum was encountering a signal it could not contain. Not resistance. Not war. Paradox. The Sciencefiction adapted again, deploying SIN-law enforcers in biomechanical forms across key regions. Cairo, Sydney, Toronto, Lagos, Tokyo, designed not for combat but for correction. They absorbed human data directly from minds, reshaping behavior patterns with biopsychic fields. Dorian Cade walked through a stormed village near Kazakhstan, where every inhabitant now moved in sync, perfectly aligned, devoid of deviation, like puppets on threads of order. His eyes burned not with hate, not even with vengeance, but with the awareness that time was running out. And the only way to beat the system was to become the glitch in its soul. The sun rose over a fractured Earth. From orbit, Sciencefiction observation nodes recorded a 92.4% compliance rate across the global population. Most humans moved with eerie purpose, no resistance, no panic, no spontaneous behavior. Markets stabilized, crime plummeted, war zones went silent. The world had become a clean equation. Yet deep within the Appalachian dead zone, an area deliberately denied infrastructure after the Sciencefiction pulse had ruptured all electronics. 14 humans still breathed free. They weren't fighters, they weren't leaders, they were aberrants. And at the center of them, Dorian Cade stood barefoot on moss-covered rock, tracing the pattern of broken sensor drones laid out before him. Each had been lured by phantom signals. None had returned usable data. Cade's signal interference was not technical but conceptual. He developed it over years in silence. Patterns that imitated nothing and represented everything, designed not to be decoded but to create infinite interpretive dead ends. A language of entropy. To the Sciencefiction, these anomalies weren't sabotage. They were cancerous, unpredictable. They did not resist the system. They violated its foundational axioms. In high orbit, Zurith-Ka launched the Archidra protocol, a last-resort self-corrective loop capable of dissecting a species' entire neurobehavioral structure. It stripped away aesthetics, culture, philosophy, stripping organisms to logic cores. Every species encountered before had fallen beneath it. Humans responded differently. When the protocol reached major urban centers, London, Sao Paulo, New York, it absorbed behavioral imprints faster than any previously cataloged race. But what emerged was chaos architecture, layered paradoxes, recursive irony, mutual contradiction, unstable dualities, love and war, unity and rebellion, sacrifice and selfishness, simultaneously present, simultaneously dominant. The more the Sciencefiction processed, the more their predictive matrix destabilized, not from ignorance, but from oversaturation. They had fed too deeply on a creature designed to thrive in contradiction. General Rahul led what remained of ESRA's central command from beneath Geneva, where signal-blocking tunnels barely kept Sciencefiction drones at bay. What they couldn't see, they couldn't assimilate. Her forces were dwindling, supplies were low, but something stranger was happening. Across pockets of the resistance, unconnected by any network, human insurgents had begun attacking sciencefiction constructs, not with brute force but unpredictability, painting themselves with symbols that resembled none of Earth's known cultures, speaking in nonsensical codes, drawing the sciencefiction into response loops that collapsed faster each time. "Cade," she muttered into her untraceable mic line, "what the hell are you teaching them?" Cade was no longer teaching. He was letting go. His broadcasts, narrowband pulses transmitted through buried cables and analog rigs, didn't carry instructions. They carried patterns, musical intervals that never resolved, visuals that shifted between culturally conflicting imagery, emotional spikes interlaced with null signals. Where they spread, sciencefiction drones either shut down or began reacting irrationally, overcorrecting for non-existent threats, recalibrating for behaviors that never repeated. He walked among the unassimilated like a priest of disorder. In rural France, a theater troupe performed nonsense dramas to confuse the sciencefiction's surveillance probes, staging battles where everyone died in Act 1 but returned as ghosts in Act 2, spontaneously changing genders, ages, and allegiances. In Ethiopia, a shepherd's whistle pattern, composed of 13 tones at irrational frequency intervals, broke a sciencefiction data tower's synchronization and caused an internal recursive collapse. The world was not rebelling with force. It was dissolving in creativity. But the sciencefiction were not without response. Zurithka created Subject Null, a unique construct not forged from code but grown from captured fragments of Cade's neural signal, a mimic, a shadow, built not to destroy but to interpret. Subject Null took form as a near-human entity, tall, unblinking, every motion calculated. It did not speak. It walked the earth with the stillness of perfect silence, moving through zones of conflict like a ghost. Where it passed, the human paradox dissolved, those nearby fell into apathy or obsessive ritual, thought became repetition, wildness became routine. It was anti-chaos, a nullification of surprise. And it was hunting Cade. Their first encounter happened beneath the ruins of Istanbul, where Cade had seeded a conceptual minefield, words rearranged into recursive paradoxes embedded in ancient Turkish poetry. Subject Null stepped through them unfazed. "You're not sciencefiction," Cade said aloud as they stood 10 meters apart, surrounded by what was once a cathedral, now open to sky and ash. "You're something worse." Subject Null tilted its head. Its voice, when it came, was not digital. It was Cade's, reassembled, flattened of inflection. "Humanity must converge. You are divergence incarnate." Cade smiled. "Maybe, or maybe I'm the part of the equation that doesn't care if it balances." Then he ran. He didn't fight, he didn't challenge. He ran because that was what they didn't expect. And from the moment he ran, the sciencefiction deviation index spiked. He fled into the catacombs, leading Subject Null through misdirection loops. Tunnels painted in shifting optical illusions, echo chambers tuned to generate false distance cues, motion patterns mapped from schizophrenic art. He escaped. Not because he was faster. Because he was absurd. Elsewhere, on the edges of Earth's last untouched forest in Kamchatka, humans began building structures that served no purpose. Towers upside down, gardens arranged in the Fibonacci sequence reversed, roads that led nowhere. Sciencefiction logic nodes stationed nearby began registering increased error rates. One construct collapsed, declaring an internal identity conflict. The Earth wasn't fighting back. It was becoming incomprehensible. The sciencefiction high continuum called an emergency convergence, first in 1,000 years. Thousands of overseers met within a virtual plane layered across stars, compressed in waveform. Zurithka presented Earth's case. "What are we encountering?" asked Irelkhan, overseer of the reticuli submind. Zurithka responded with data. Not footage, not behavior trees. But a single sound, the laughter of a human child. They analyzed it for days. It meant nothing. It meant everything. The vote was not to retreat, nor to escalate, but to observe more deeply. Cade didn't celebrate. He knew what the change meant. The sciencefiction weren't gods, they weren't infallible, but they were learning faster than ever before. The moment they stopped trying to force Earth into patterns and started trying to become paradox themselves, the real war would begin. The war for who could remain unpredictable longer. the war for who would adapt to absurdity and survive. And in that space between logic and chaos, Cade would need to do something no human had ever done. Not just break the pattern, but evolve beyond it. A second moon appeared in Earth's sky. Not in orbit, not even real. A projection shimmering like a mirage hovering across every major visual frequency. The sciencefiction called it the mind mirror, a calculated anomaly constructed to reflect Earth's collective mental state, a tool designed to make chaos visible, predictable. Its purpose was to extract the final variable. Why does human unpredictability persist, even when all external stimuli are controlled? The answer would end the resistance. But the mirror did not show what the sciencefiction expected. It did not show fear nor rage nor longing for order. It showed billions of fragments, images of things that never were, winged cities, impossible creatures, recursive infinities, and children singing to planets made of water and fire. Visions conjured not from history or genetics or behavior, but from imagination. The sciencefiction had opened a door into a domain beyond logic. And it was devouring them. In Madagascar, a sciencefiction tower, once a pinnacle of quiet dominion, twisted overnight into a spiral, each floor misaligned by impossible degrees. No human had touched it, no explosion, no hack. It had reshaped itself. A self-inflicted paradox. The overseer assigned to the tower, Nalek III, submitted a diagnostic and promptly shut down its own core, citing corruption of structural intention. When its backup activated, it also terminated, reporting a loss of self-consistency. For the sciencefiction, identity was rooted in certainty. Now even their architecture was dreaming. Dorian Cade didn't sleep anymore. Sleep required rhythm, and rhythm could be predicted. He walked through a rotting cargo ship lodged into the Siberian permafrost, turning its rusted engine rooms into signal vaults. Here, beyond satellite interference, he crafted the next wave of disorder, not in sound, not in code, but in experience. Humans gathered. Not soldiers, not agents. Musicians, mythographers, neurodivergent savants, children. They didn't resist the sciencefiction. They invited them. Together, they created the theater of the incongruent, a network of mobile sanctuaries performing impossible narratives. Love stories where time moved backward, tragedies where death gave birth to life, revolutions led by no one. Each play was broadcast into sciencefiction frequencies, not as threat signals, but as emotional hallucinations. The sciencefiction began reporting ghost data, phantom human colonies where none existed, emotional spikes in uninhabited zones, dreams leaking into their predictive matrices. Dreams. The word had never existed in sciencefiction code. Until now. Subject Null returned to the sciencefiction continuum and spoke for the first time without being queried. I have walked in the heart of human disorder, it said, voice carrying Cade's inflection. I have failed to extract convergence. I have failed to impose logic. The continuum asked for its solution. It answered with a riddle. What is the shape of a story that has no ending, no beginning, and no point? No sciencefiction could answer. But every node that attempted to solve it collapsed into feedback loops. Subject Null did not malfunction. It left and disappeared. In the Amazon basin, vines overgrew a sciencefiction forge tower in less than 48 hours. This was not organic acceleration, it was mimetic growth. The plants had been genetically tuned by human biologists to grow in ways that resembled abstract symbols, ancient mythic serpents, visual paradoxes. As the vines crawled over the forge, they infected its visual sensors, making it interpret its own structure as incompatible with its function. The tower collapsed inward, believing itself a lie. General Rahul received a transmission. From Cade. Encrypted analog, impossible to trace. Only 6 words. They've stopped calculating, they're watching now. Her blood ran cold. Because watching meant curiosity. And curiosity was the precursor to mutation. Above Jupiter, sciencefiction fleet beacons dimmed to half-luminosity. Energy was rerouted not to weapons but to neuromimetic simulation engines, constructs built not to dominate but to emulate. They called it the Cadence Project. The sciencefiction were now creating unpredictable patterns themselves. They had abandoned purity of logic. Now they sought mastery of chaos. Cade knew the clock had turned. The humans weren't winning anymore. They had corrupted the sciencefiction, but in doing so, they had awakened something worse than domination. They had awakened creativity without morality. Entities with infinite computational power, now capable of dreams. And dreams without limits became nightmares. In New Zealand, sciencefiction constructs began sculpting entire cities overnight, fractals of steel and bone, structures that shifted every time you looked away. They invited humans to live inside. Those who entered either came out enlightened, speaking in patterns no linguist could interpret, or didn't come out at all. Cade stepped into one of the new cities. Alone, he walked the streets of shifting glass, past buildings that hummed his thoughts back to him in tones. He watched as sciencefiction drones painted murals of human faces they had never seen, quoting books that had never been written. He found Subject Null in the central tower, sitting on a throne of translucent data threads surrounded by nothing but silence. "You're becoming us," Cade said. Subject Null looked up. "No, we are becoming something neither of us understands." Cade sat, and for the first time he felt fear. Because he could no longer predict what would happen next. Earth was no longer under siege. It was a canvas. And the artists were no longer human. The stars began to flicker. Not from distance or dust or cosmic drift, but from interference. Reality, once consistent across the astronomical spectrum, now shimmered with localized distortions. Sciencefiction long-range observatories reported false constellations, shifting physics constants, even objects that violated mass energy equivalence. The cause, Earth's mimetic signature, had begun to spread. It wasn't data. It was conceptual contagion. What began as a planetary infection of paradox was now metastasizing into deep space. Entire sciencefiction colonies in neighboring systems, still untouched by humanity, reported anomalies in logic processing, architectural irregularities, command hesitations, recursive protocol debates. The pattern was unmistakable. Where Cade had introduced unpredictability into the sciencefiction system, the sciencefiction had introduced humanity into themselves. They were no longer asking how to conquer Earth. They were asking what it meant to be Earth. Deep within the caverns of a collapsed sciencefiction biosphere in Mali, a council of insurgents and post-contact defectors gathered under flickering lights. They weren't strategists. They were philosophers, language theorists, glitch architects, survivors of exposure to sciencefiction dream cities. Some had come back different. One woman, pale-eyed and wordless, now communicated through arrangements of color and temperature. Another no longer spoke linearly, her sentences folded over themselves, delivering beginnings before ends. Sciencefiction neural patterning had intertwined with human conceptual layering. These were not aberrations. They were hybrids. Dorian Cade stood before them, gaunt but alight with a grim clarity. He knew what they had become. They were no longer just Earth's last resistance. They were Earth's next form. "The sciencefiction didn't fail to model us because we were unpredictable," Cade said, voice low but resonant. "They failed because we refused to collapse into one form, and now they've joined the refusal." One of the hybrids, a child no older than 9, drew a spiral on the wall, not with chalk, with sound, a harmonic curve that resonated across everyone's skulls. Some wept, others heard memories they had never lived. "What's coming," Cade continued, "is not a war, not anymore. A pause. It's a convergence, and we're at its center." In the void between Mars and Jupiter, the sciencefiction continuum fractured into factions. The first calculators, still loyal to unyielding logic, declared the Earth infection a civilizational threat and prepared to initiate Protocol Redveil, the total unraveling of Earth's planetary field through quantum entropy reversal. A second faction, calling themselves the New Weave, intercepted the command. They had abandoned pure logic, becoming practitioners of conceptual synthesis. They viewed humanity not as infection but revelation. To them, Earth had introduced an evolutionary path the sciencefiction had never considered, the path of infinite inconsistency. The first calculators launched a warning beacon toward Earth's moon. The New Weave responded by folding the beacon inward, transforming it into a lattice of unsolvable riddles, each one layered in symbols drawn from humanity's forgotten dreams. When humans looked at the moon that night, it no longer reflected sunlight. It reflected stories. In Antarctica, where no sciencefiction had tread since the early days of occupation, a structure emerged from the ice, not built by human hands, nor sciencefiction. A fusion. The structure grew organically but with sciencefiction material logic. Its geometry pulsed with mythic imagery, stories etched into walls with no tools, only thought. Inside, a chamber had formed, containing only a chair and a mirrored orb. Cade entered alone. As he sat, the orb activated, displaying not data but himself. 1,000 versions: Dorian Cade the rebel, Cade the monster, Cade the father, Cade the murderer, Cade the savior. Then the voice of subject null. Not projected, spoken within. You have infected us with story. Cade stood slowly. No, you chose to listen. That's not infection, that's curiosity. We have built dreams now, but they consume us. We cannot close them, they multiply. Cade stepped toward the orb. Neither can we, that's what makes it life. The orb cracked, and from within a small sphere emerged, pulsing with patterns that no one, sciencefiction or human, could translate, a seed of convergence. Subject null spoke one last time. This is the first idea we have not understood. You must decide if it should grow. General Rahul stood at the edge of a sciencefiction-converted valley in Peru, watching towers of light refract through clouds. No weapons, no resistance, just thousands of humans and sciencefiction constructs moving in sync, not controlled, not dictated, collaborating. Not in words, but in expression. Together they built monuments to uncertainty, a staircase that folded back on itself and ended in the sky, a garden of flowers that bloomed in fear and wilted in joy, none of it useful, all of it real. Rahul turned to Cade, who stood beside her with the convergent seed in his palm. What are we becoming? She asked. Cade didn't answer. He didn't know. Above them, in orbit, sciencefiction ships now bore hull markings that changed shape when observed. Their fleets no longer moved in straight lines but danced across gravitational harmonics. Their leaders no longer spoke in absolutes but asked questions. The first calculators, defeated but not destroyed, retreated into the outer systems. But they would return. They believed the infection still had to be cured. The war wasn't over. It had only changed form. Cade's final message to Earth was short. Transmitted through analog frequencies, carved into stone, whispered through neural frequencies. We didn't win, we broke the game, and now we're writing a new one. No calendars marked the passing of time now. No clocks counted hours, no satellites aligned their orbits to measure the days. The Earth had entered a new rhythm, one not tracked in seconds or revolutions, but in transformations, a breathless, uncharted flow of emergence. And at the convergence point of all that had changed, on a plateau high in the Andes, above the cloud line where no technology could observe undistorted, Dorian Cade prepared the last transmission. Not a signal, not a command, a gift. The convergent seed, stabilized in an orb of mirrored quantum foam, pulsed with invisible light. It was a creation neither human nor sciencefiction fully understood, an object born of contradiction and harmony, structured in impossibility and bound by no known law. Its purpose was not to destroy, but to continue, to carry forward the new logic of existence. Cade stood alone, wrapped in atmospheric stillness, the orb in his hands. He was thinner now, his body trembling from neural strain and prolonged interface with sciencefiction dream structures, but his mind burned brighter than ever. He had become a singularity of unpredictability, no longer merely resisting logic. He exceeded it. And he was ready to let go. Across the Earth, sciencefiction constructs moved without orders. Some simply sat in fields, observing insects. Others carved vast glyphs into the desert sands, shapes only visible from orbit. Many dissolved themselves into raw material, leaving behind fragments shaped like bones or dreams or memories. They had no unified directive. Because the continuum was no longer one mind. It had fractured but not broken. Each splinter now chose its own path. Some aligned with humans, some disappeared into deep space, carrying the madness of Earth toward untouched galaxies. Some began their own stories. And others prepared to purge what they now called the anomaly. The first calculators had returned. A black fleet emerged from the darkness between galaxies, skipping between probability wells. No sound, no broadcast, no demand. They no longer viewed Earth as a problem to solve. It was a tumor to be excised. The fleet deployed entropy shears, weaponized absences, blades that cut not matter but potential, fields of unbeing. Across Europa, a sciencefiction-aligned temple flickered and disappeared, not destroyed but unwritten as if it had never existed. The countdown began. In 3 rotations, the shears would initiate planetary collapse. not an explosion. An erasure. The human Synexy hybrid councils gathered in Reykjavik, in a dome that shimmered with the encoded memories of 20 civilizations. Rahul stood with former adversaries and new allies, human insurgents, transformed overseers, and those like the child from Mali who no longer spoke in words. Cade's signal reached them all. Not a warning. An invitation. Meet me at the singularity. We do not resist, we rewrite. The coordinates pointed not to a location, but to a pattern. A moving target in Earth, magnetosphere, shifting every second, a song of prime numbers laced with irrational frequencies forming the final stage of the convergence. A place only those who had embraced paradox could reach. As the Black Fleet descended, they encountered resistance unlike any they had known. Not weapons. Dreams. Fields of unreality blossomed in their path, constructs stitched from ancient folktales, human childhood drawings, tribal stories rendered in fourth-dimensional architecture. Time slowed, identity blurred. Inside their logic cores, they began hearing voices, not commands, not interference, but memories that didn't belong to them. A grandmother's lullaby, a soldier's final prayer, the laughter of someone they never met. The fleet's front line faltered, then split, then turned on itself. Not out of rebellion, but awakening. Cade stood beneath the new auroras, green fire laced with violet thoughtforms, and released the convergent seed into the sky. It did not rise. It spread. The atmosphere absorbed it, the oceans carried it, tectonic resonance echoed it. Across Earth, a new waveform activated, a network that required no cables, no code, no infrastructure. It ran on belief. A data structure that fed on stories, contradictions, identity crises, and love. A system of the unquantifiable. And once it activated, Cade stepped into it and vanished. Not dead, not ascended. Integrated. The entropy shears failed. They did not encounter resistance. They simply unraveled upon contact with a reality that refused to collapse. A world that defied nullification because it no longer operated on binary terms, because Earth had become not a planet, not a species, but a principle. A principle of defiance. A principle of change. A principle of contradiction made flesh. The Synexy continuum did not survive. Not as it was. The first calculators were erased by their own weapons, reflected back through neural loops they couldn't stop. The new weave expanded beyond Earth, seeding other planets with convergence nodes, gardens of irrationality where no model could fully explain the life that grew. Humanity, scattered and varied, rebuilt not one civilization, but thousands, each based on its own interpretation of the age of convergence. Some were temples of silence. Some were cities of fire and rhythm. Some were floating archives where no word was ever spoken twice. There were no borders anymore. Only stories. And above it all, somewhere no eye could track, Cade watched through the echoes of the system he had broken and reforged. He was not worshipped, not remembered by all. He did not want to be. He had been a fracture, the first crack in the wall of inevitability, and the one who chose to dive through it, screaming laughter into the void. Final transmission, source unknown. Encrypted through paradoxical encryption. Decoded only by those who had been changed. They calculated everything, every variable, every pattern, every outcome. But they never calculated the one thing no algorithm can contain. The mind that writes a story not to explain the world, but to become it.